It is not just the MS Norman Atlantic. It is a question that has never been answered. How could a massive modern Ro-Pax ferry a steel fortress worth a fortune and advertised as the vital artery between Greece and Italy collapse into a floating furnace just 33 miles from the Otranto Strait? Why did a system designed to defy the brutal Adriatic winter surrender to a single, trivial spark inside a refrigeration truck? And more importantly, why did nearly 500 passengers become the first victims of the very confidence they trusted? But that is only the surface. Behind the moment the ship glowed red, like a dying ember against the pitch-black sea, lies another story less told, but equally dangerous, about ghost passengers who never existed on paper. A chaotic command chain, paralyzed by nature, and a chain of small errors merging into history. Why did it all happen in the early hours of December 2014? And what actually killed the Norman Atlantic, the inferno rising from the depths, the freezing gale hammering from above, or the human element? Stay tuned, because the truth about the Norman Atlantic is unlike any story you know. December 28, 2014, the port of Patras, Greece. If you stood on the dock that evening looking up at the MS Norman Atlantic, you would not see a vessel. You would see a monument to human competence. She was a sprawling 27,000-ton behemoth of white steel and glass, a roll-on, roll-off giant designed to tame the Adriatic Sea. She was leased by Adriatic Lines, a trusted name, a promise of efficiency connecting the rugged coast of Greece to the industrial heart of Italy. For the hundreds of passengers boarding that night, the ship was a sanctuary. Outside, the winter air was biting, carrying the sharp, salty promise of a brewing storm. But inside the Norman Atlantic was a world of golden light and manufactured warmth. The air smelled of heavy Maritime diesel strong coffee and the faint, expensive scent of duty-free perfume. It was the smell of civilization. The loading process was a mechanical ballet. The stern ramp lowered with a heavy industrial groan, swallowing cars, tankers, and refrigerated trucks one by one. The crew worked with the practiced apathy of men who had done this 1,000 times. They packed the vehicles tight, bumper to bumper, mirror to mirror, maximizing every inch of the open deck floor. It was efficiency at its finest. The deckhands waved the final refrigerated trucks into their slots, listening to the hum of the cooling motors, oblivious that they were not merely loading cargo, but carefully arranging the kindling for a pyre. As the ship pulled away from the dock, first stopping at Igoumenitsa and then turning northwest towards Ancona, the atmosphere on board was one of seductive comfort. The ship's stabilizers fought the initial chop of the waves, turning the ocean's violence into a gentle rhythmic cradle. In the passenger lounges, the television screens flickered with news and sports. In the restaurant, cutlery clinked against ceramic plates. Families laughed, sharing meals, feeling the immense solidity of the floor beneath them. It felt permanent. It felt invincible. For the truck drivers, the ferry was less of a luxury and more of a floating motel. Many of them, exhausted from the long haul across the Balkans, ignored the regulations to sleep in the cabins above. Instead, they stayed below in the cavernous belly of the ship, curling up inside their cabs on the car deck. It was quieter there, familiar, a private space amidst the steel. They cracked their windows to let in the air, unaware that the ventilation systems were struggling against the sheer density of the cargo. Up on the bridge, the mood was professional calm. The captain and his officers watched the radar screens glowing green in the dim light. They were aware of the weather reports. A severe gale was churning the Adriatic, bringing with it sleet and high swells, but the Norman Atlantic was built for this. She was a modern machine equipped with fire suppression systems, lifeboats, and redundant engines. The storm was just data to be managed. As the passengers finally retreated to their cabins, the gentle hypnotic vibration of the main engines lulled them into a deep sleep, effectively masking the silent, microscopic heat beginning to radiate from a single electrical fault deep within the labyrinth of Deck 4. By the time the ship reached the Otranto Strait, the Golden Dream was complete. The passengers were warm, dry, and safe. The sea outside was a chaotic, freezing void, but the steel walls held it back with arrogant ease. There was no reason to be afraid. The logic of the modern world dictated that they would arrive in Ancona the next morning. The systems were working. The lights were on. The coffee was hot. The Norman Atlantic pushed forward into the dark, a confident intruder in a predator ocean, carrying its sleeping cargo toward a dawn that many of them would never see. Oh 5:30 a.m. The Adriatic is pitch black. The world is a violent mixture of 50-knot winds and freezing sleet. Deep in the bowels of the Norman Atlantic on Deck 4, the laws of physics stop negotiating. A refrigeration unit on a heavy truck, overworked and vibrating against the steel hull sparks. It is a tiny, insignificant flash, but here packed tight among tankers of olive oil and synthetic materials, it is a detonator. The fire does not grow, it explodes. It inhales the oxygen in the cavernous garage and exhales a thick, toxic soup of burning rubber and melting plastic. The heat instantly spikes to temperatures that warp steel. The truck drivers sleeping in their cabs, the unauthorized ghosts of the manifest, wake up to a nightmare of blinding smoke. They have seconds. Most do not even have that. As a passenger on Deck 6 turns in his sleep, dreaming of the Italian coast, the fire suppression system on Deck 4 engages and fails to drown the thermal runaway. The alarm finally tears through the ship. It is not a warning. It is a scream. Hundreds of passengers jolt awake in their cabins. The air is already different, hot, acrid tasting of burnt electrical wire. Panic is immediate. Doors fly open. The corridors, once wide and welcoming, are now choking tunnels of gray smoke. The lights flicker. Then they die. The blackout hits. The ship is now a labyrinth of darkness. The only light comes from the terrifying orange glow pulsing from the floorboards and the dim green beams of emergency exit signs that are rapidly disappearing behind the smog. People scramble upward. It is a primal stampede. They claw their way toward the upper decks, driven by the reptilian instinct to breathe. They spill out onto the open deck, gasping for air. But there is no relief. They have traded the oven for the freezer. The gale force winds hit them like a physical blow, knocking people off their feet. The temperature is near freezing. The ocean is crashing over the rails, sending sprays of icy salt water into the faces of the terrified crowd. And then the ship begins to die. The fire eats the main electrical cables. The engines cut out. The massive vessel loses steerage. She is no longer a ship. She is a burning piece of debris drifting helplessly toward the Albanian coast. The Chimney Effect takes hold. The heat from the garage rises through the stairwells and ventilation shafts, turning the superstructure into a vertical kiln. The passengers are trapped on the highest deck, huddled together. As the first officer shouts into the radio for a nearby merchant vessel, the paint on the exterior of the funnel behind him begins to blister and peel in silent, synchronized sheets. The heat rising from below becomes a torture device. The steel deck plates begin to cook. It is a slow, agonizing rise in temperature. Passengers shift their weight, lifting one foot and then the other. It is not just uncomfortable, it is searing. The rubber soles of their shoes begin to soften. Then they turn sticky. Then they melt. Survivors are forced to stand on the melting remnants of their own footwear, dancing a horrific jig between the fire beneath the steel and the ice falling from the sky. The visuals are apocalyptic. To the west, the lights of Italy are invisible. To the east, nothing but the storm. Below them, the car deck is glowing a dull, angry red, illuminating the churning waves with the color of blood. The rescue effort begins, but it is a war against nature, the spirit of Piraeus. A container ship arrives but cannot get close. The waves are 6 meters high. To launch a lifeboat is suicide. The Norman Atlantic's own lifeboats are largely useless. One is engulfed in flames, others are stuck in the mechanisms or smashed by the waves. The only way out is up. Helicopters. But this is not a movie. This is a slow, grinding ordeal. The Italian and Greek helicopters hover overhead, fighting the turbulence. The winchmen are swung like pendulums in the gale, slamming against the railings, trying to drop a basket to a panicked mob of hundreds. They can only lift 2 or 3 people at a time. 2 people. Every 15 minutes. The math is terrifying. As a helicopter pilot fights the yoke to hold a steady hover, a single window on the passenger deck explodes outward, showering the sea with glass that glitters like diamonds before vanishing into the dark. The siege lasts for 36 hours. 36 hours of freezing spray. 36 hours of inhaling carcinogens. 36 hours of watching the person next to you succumb to hypothermia while the floor burns their feet. The ship lists to the right. The smoke gets thicker. There is a moment of false hope. A tugboat manages to attach a line. The passengers cheer a ragged, desperate sound. They think they are being towed to safety. Snap.
It's secure. Thank God. We're safe now.
The cable breaks under the strain of the storm. The hope vanishes, instantly replaced by the crushing reality that they are still drifting. The fire is not done. It moves methodically, consuming the cabins, the lounges, the golden dream of Act 2. It erases the luxury. It melts the duty-free perfume bottles, the televisions, the soft mattresses. It leaves nothing but blackened skeletons of steel. On the top deck, the survivors are no longer people. They are huddles of soot and ice. They stop screaming. They simply wait, caught in the indifferent, violent embrace of the Adriatic, watching the rotors chop the air above them, praying they are next. The ocean finally relinquished its grip, not because it was finished, but because the machines took over. The rescue phase ended, but the Norman Atlantic did not die immediately. She remained a stubborn, smoldering island of toxicity drifting towards the Albanian coastline. It took a fleet of ocean-going tugs, massive engines churning the gray water white to lasso the Leviathan. They dragged the charred husk across the Adriatic, a funeral procession of steel and smoke heading towards the port of Brindisi, Italy. From the shore, she looked like a warship returning from a lost battle.
Pull it tight.
The once pristine white paint was peeled back to raw, rusted iron. The bridge windows were black sockets. Smoke still curled lazily from the vents, a signal that the heart of the beast was still beating with residual heat. When the ship finally docked, the silence that fell over the port was heavier than the noise of the storm. The resurrection began not of the passengers, but of the truth. It was an engineering nightmare. The ship was not just a crime scene, it was a biohazard zone. The fire had raged for so long and with such intensity that the structural integrity of the upper decks was compromised. The steel had undergone thermoplastic deformation. It had softened, sagged, and hardened again in twisted, unnatural shapes. Investigators could not simply walk in. They had to wait. The Norman Atlantic was a thermal battery storing temperatures of hundreds of degrees deep within her cargo holds long after the open flames had died. When the specialized teams finally boarded clad in hazmat suits and breathing apparatus, they entered a world stripped of color. Everything was gray. The soot was ankle deep, a fine choking powder that covered the golden dream of the passenger lounges. The duty-free shops, the restaurants, the cabins, they were reduced to carbon outlines. But the true horror lay below on Deck 4. Opening the stern ramp was like unsealing a tomb from an ancient violent era. The smell that rolled out was complex, a chemical cocktail of burnt diesel, incinerated plastics, and organic decay. What the forensic engineers found inside defied standard categorization. The car deck, the antagonist of our story, had transformed into a single fused monolith. The trucks and cars were no longer individual vehicles. The intense heat, estimated to have exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius at the peak of the blaze, had melted the aluminum bodies of the trailers and the glass of the windshields. The metals had flowed like water pooling on the deck plates and cooling into abstract silver puddles that welded the wreckage to the ship itself. To separate the trucks, salvage crews had to use industrial cutting torches, slicing through the new alloys created by the fire. It was an autopsy performed with heavy machinery. In the corner of the deck, a firefighter's flashlight beam swept across a mound of gray ash, illuminating a steel wristwatch that had stopped exactly at 5:32 a.m., ticking for an audience of ghosts. As they peeled back the layers of burnt steel, the resurrection revealed the second betrayal of the numbers. During the crisis, the passenger manifest had been the Bible of the rescue operation. Authorities believed they were looking for a specific number of souls. But as the investigators sifted through the wreckage, the terrifying reality of the human element became clear. The list was a lie. They found remains where there should have been none. They found empty spaces where people were supposed to be. The Norman Atlantic, like many ferries traversing these waters, had been a vessel for the desperate. Illegal migrant stowaways, hoping to reach Italy, had hidden inside the very trucks that started the fire. They were the invisible victims, men and women who never purchased a ticket, and therefore, in the eyes of the bureaucracy, did not exist. The forensic teams had to resort to DNA testing against a global database of missing persons to identify bone fragments found fused to the truck axles. The discrepancy was maddening. The official death toll stood at 12. But the number of missing remained a nebulous, shifting figure, potentially nearly 20. The sea and the fire had conspired to erase the evidence so thoroughly that some families would never receive a body-only legal declaration. The investigation also turned its lens on the ship's systems. The resurrection of the data recorder. The Voyage Data Recorder VDR painted a damning picture of the initial response. The fire suppression system, the deluge drenchers designed to flood the car deck, were scrutinized. The valves were found. The pipes were analyzed. The terrible question was asked. Was it a mechanical failure or a hesitation? Did the crew, fearing the damage to the cargo, wait too long to release the water? Or did the system trigger only to find itself overwhelmed by the sheer caloric density of the burning olive oil and tires? The investigation revealed that the fire dampers the metal flaps designed to seal off the ventilation shafts and starve the fire of oxygen had failed to close completely. The chimney effect wasn't just bad luck. It was a mechanical surrender. The ship had inhaled the gale, feeding the fire with fresh oxygen at the precise moment it needed to be suffocated. The salvage operation took months. The Norman Atlantic was eventually towed to Aliaga, Turkey to be scrapped. The breakers' yards are the final resting places of these steel giants. There under the hot sun, the ship was cut apart, piece by piece. The resurrection was clinical cold and absolute. It turned a tragedy of human suffering into a report of thermal units, stress fractures, and liability clauses. The emotional terror of the passengers on the top deck was translated into dry legal text about negligence and safety protocols. But for those who walked the blackened corridors during the investigation, the story was not in the report. It was in the silence of the car deck, where the outline of a handprint was found seared into a bulkhead, a permanent testament to the moment where the human timeline ended and the geological timeline of the metal began. The legal battles following the Norman Atlantic disaster dragged on for years, a labyrinth of litigation as complex as the ship's own corridors. Captains were charged, ferry operators were fined, and new regulations were drafted in the sterile meeting rooms of the International Maritime Organization. They promised safer stowage plans, better fire detection, and stricter passenger counting. But paper does not put out fires. The Norman Atlantic serves as a brutal, freezing reminder of a truth we often choose to ignore: our modern world with its GPS. Its satellite tracking and its titanium alloys is merely a thin veneer over the ancient forces of the Earth. We build floating cities and fill them with the comforts of home, the coffee, the televisions, the soft beds, to distract ourselves from the reality that we are trespassing on a predator ocean. The sea does not hate us. The fire does not judge us. They simply wait for a single broken circuit, a single loose valve, or a single moment of human complacency. When you next step onto a ferry surrounded by the smell of expensive perfume and the hum of powerful engines, take a moment. Look past the golden lights, feel the vibration in the floor, and ask yourself, if the lights go out and the heat rises, do you know where the exit is? Because the Norman Atlantic taught us that when the systems fail, there is no first class. There is only the fire, the ice, and the steel. History is not just dates and numbers. It is the collective memory of our species. Thank you for taking the time to remember these events with us. If you have a story or an event you believe deserves to be told, leave it in the comments. We are listening